Welcome to the APUSH DIG. This week we will investigate change during what historians call the Progressive Era in U.S. history, roughly from 1898 to 1920. The developments in this era can be viewed as a reaction against the excesses and errors of the U.S. during the Gilded Age. At the end of the 19th century, the federal government worked hand in hand with corporations to rapidly industrialize the U.S. and greatly expand its financial interests. In the beginning of the 20th century, however, we will see governments at the federal, state, and local levels implement a variety of reforms to correct the problems Americans faced. What we want to consider is this: to what extent did progressive reformers make the U.S. more democratic? Here's the historical big picture we need to understand. In the progressive era of the early 20th century, progressive reformers, also just referred to as progressives, responded to political corruption, economic instability, and social concerns by calling for greater government action and other political and social measures. Progressives tried to expose and delegitimize urban political machines. Progressives believed government should act more like a referee to the national economy, as a way to protect consumers and to prevent economic depressions, such as the one that struck in 1893. Progressives also tried to tackle a variety of health and social problems in the U.S. Progressives came from both the Republican and Democratic parties. While the general political mood in this era was pro-reform, we should never think that all progressives agreed on just what needed improving and how to do it. Let's continue to build a big picture understanding of this period. The Progressive Era was one of intense social and political reform aimed at making progress towards a better society. Reformers sought to harness the power of the federal government to eliminate unfair business practices, reduce corruption, and to counteract the negative social effects of industrialization. Protections for workers and consumers were strengthened, and women finally achieved the right to vote. Overall, there was a belief that there could be a scientific, rational, and pragmatic solution to every problem. Who were the progressives? They were an extremely diverse group. For example, some progressives viewed segregation as a vile social ill that needed remedy in the U.S., while other progressives believed segregation was the solution to the U.S.'s racial issues. So here, clearly, we see that the term progressive was a very large tent with many different groups beneath it. Most progressives came from the urban middle class. This should make sense. The greatest social issues created by the Gilded Age's excesses were often seen most easily in the cities. Those from the ruling class would not be likely to see those from the ruling class would not likely want to see these systems change. And those from the working class were often struggling just to get by. Political organizing was difficult. Middle-class reformers were motivated often from a religious perspective. Their belief in the social gospel meant that they sought to use Christian principles as the means to address social problems. Progressives were pragmatic. For every social problem, they believed there was a technical fix that could be devised. There were many impressive political and social reforms secured in the Progressive Era. By 1910, all states had adopted the secret ballot. Voting was finally done privately. By 1913, all U.S. senators were elected by popular vote. By 1915, direct primaries were enacted in every state so that people could select their party's presidential nominee. The initiative, referendum, recall gave voters in many states the ability to directly call for and pass state legislation. Passed in 1920, the 19th Amendment protected the right to vote for women. By 1915, 2/3 of states prohibited the sale of alcohol, and in 1919, alcohol was prohibited nationwide. In terms of social welfare, we see more schools being built, more juvenile courts, liberalized divorce laws, and many more residential and business safety regulations. And finally, we see the first anti-child labor laws enacted. I hope that you are seeing that this progressive period was one of great change. But where does reform come from? Often it comes from the demands of the people. Progressive politicians may have written and passed reforms, but it was the demands of the people that pushed them to do this. And often what awakened the desire for change in the minds of the people? It was thanks to the work of investigative journalists, historically known as muckrakers. Muckrakers worked to uncover corruption and health issues in America, wrote articles and essays and books about them, thus elevating the critical consciousness of Americans. Theodore Roosevelt was the first of the three so-called progressive presidents. He was a Republican who served 2 terms as president. He called his progressive plan for government his square deal. Rather than just siding with corporate interests in major labor disputes, as presidents had done during the Gilded Age, Roosevelt tried to mediate in these labor conflicts between management and unions. He was known as the trust buster. Roosevelt sought to break up the big business monopolies like Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Roosevelt implemented regulations on railroad monopolies. He signed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, the first 2 real laws passed by the federal government designed for consumer protection. Finally, we must remember Roosevelt was a conservationist. He's responsible for the creation of our national park system. The next progressive president, though not as remarkable as Roosevelt, was his fellow Republican William Howard Taft. So less remarkable that I'm going to just move on. The last of the so-called progressive presidents was the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, showing that both parties in this era sought to champion the progressive mantle. Wilson continued to regulate big businesses like Roosevelt, and he will sign the 19th Amendment, which protected the right to vote for women. But let's not overlook the struggle and fight of the feminists who tirelessly worked to force Wilson to listen to their just demands. Wilson was also a white supremacist. He resegregated all of the federal offices in Washington, D.C. He screened the first ever movie at the White House, Birth of a Nation, a film that portrays the Ku Klux Klan as the heroes of the South. And finally, Wilson did nothing in response to the wave of white terrorist violence, the lynchings in the South and the race riots in the North, especially during the Red Summer of 1919. Often overlooked is the importance of the Socialist Party during the Progressive Era. Though the party never wins the presidency, across their nation there were hundreds of elected officials from the Socialist Party. Socialists were different than progressives. Progressives believed that the systemic problems in the US could be fixed with scientific reform. Socialists, however, believed that it was the system itself that was the problem. No amount of reform would be enough. Instead, the capitalist political economy of the US had to be challenged and had to be dismantled. The Socialist Party was dedicated to the welfare of the working class and won some impressive victories in this era, such as the public ownership of some utilities in big cities, the 8-hour workday, and pensions for public employees. Eugene V. Debs was the party's founder and its most influential leader. In every social movement of any era in our history, women, of course, played a huge role. During the Progressive Era, women also fought to improve their own conditions. They fought for the right to vote, for the right to have control over their marriages, over their children, and over their own bodies. Let's not forget the other side of America during the so-called progressive years. This was still the time of entrenched white supremacy and white terrorism, of segregation, of second-class status for people of color, of Jim Crow life for black people. Many progressives, like Woodrow Wilson, believed the solution to racial problems in America was even stricter and expanded segregation, thus working to perpetuate white supremacy in the United States. Important black leaders rose to prominence in this era. The first was Booker T. Washington. Washington was born a slave and founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He argued that black people's need for education and economic progress were most important. Known as the Atlanta Compromise, Washington contended that black people should concentrate on learning industrial skills. And once black people had a secure economic base, then the goals of political and social equality would eventually be achieved. One of Washington's fiercest and most important critics was the academic activist W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was born in the North, was educated at Harvard. He was a co-founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples. And he demanded immediate change. Whereas Washington practically accepted segregation, Du Bois in his writings, activism, and legal pursuits demanded that the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection of the laws, be immediately recognized and implemented. He immediately demanded for segregation to be destroyed and for the federal government to take an active role in trying to stop the widespread lynching that was taking place, the public execution of black bodies. Finally, let's reflect on some of the biggest changes in America during the Progressive Era, from roughly 1898 to 1920. Many states created laws that allowed for direct voting on legislation, open primary elections, and greater citizen influence on the political process. These can all be seen as great expansions of democracy. The right to vote for women was protected by the 19th Amendment, though black women's vote would continue to be suppressed until 1965. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution established the direct election of U.S. senators by popular vote. Prior to this, senators were selected by state legislatures. Now they would be chosen by the people. Finally, progressives believed that applying scientific principles allowed for governments to institute bureaucracies that could analyze data and then distribute materials to its constituents based on that data. You see, progressives were very scientific. They were looking for scientific management, and they believed that there was going to be a system to solve every problem.